Hello, everyone. Today we are looking at a game from the FIDE World Championship Knockout Tournaments from 1997. I don't know if you remember those tournaments where they had a whole bunch of players playing in the knockout format where there were like two game matches, and then if they were drawn, they went into like a blitz phase, and then Armageddon. But there were like hundreds of grandmasters playing, and ultimately the winner would be declared the world champion. And they had this format going for a couple of years, I believe. I want to say from like 97 to 99 or maybe 2000 or something like that. And there you had some quote unquote world champions that I guess weren't really embraced officially by the chess public because the championship had not been won in a match format. This was during like the big breakup with Kasparov having his own organization, and you had like brain games and all these different entities, arranging chess championships. So you had players like Ruslan Ponomaryov was a world champion. I think Anand became world champion under this format. Um, so it was an exciting tournament, but uh, I don't think it ever gained the respectability from the chess fans as creating a legit world champion. Here we look at the game between very strong Russian grandmaster Evgeny Bareev, who's 2670 at the time with the white pieces, and with the black pieces we have Vladimir P. Malaniuk, who was 2615 at the time. And anybody that studies the Dutch defense should know about this player. He's probably was one of the, if not the top Dutch defense theorists in the world. So we are going to look at the Dutch defense. So d4, f5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, g6, knight f3. So we have a Leningrad variation, bishop g7, castles, castles, and now we see this early b4 expanding rapidly on the queen side. Knight e4, and now c4 from Bareev. Okay, so just analyze it from this point. It's probably a little early. We could have gone a few more moves, but from analyzing at this point, we can see uh, that basically there's really no open files or diagonals at this point, save the c1 h6 diagonal where the dark square bishop is on. Um, and we have this semi-open diagonal where black's dark bishop is standing from g7 to a1. A lot of times in these scenarios, black is sometimes able to play the move c5. So this early b4 often prevents those kind of scenarios. Um, because what it is sometimes black will exploit the situation after, say, white has a setup like b3, this type of setup here, and then he has fan kettled his bishop. And with the pawn on b3, black is able to strike the center with c5, exploiting the fact that this pawn cannot capture at this time because of the exposure of the bishop and or rook sometimes. So b4, those prevents black from at least pursuing that angle. And at the same time, it falls right in with white's plan of this rapid expansion on the queen side. Moving on, so there's not really many open files or diagonals here. We have a few semi-open uh, diagonals, but that's about it. Of course, you always want to keep an eye on that b3 to g8 diagonal where the king is on. Famous. I don't know how famous the quote is, but it's famous to me. And Artur Yusupov once said that, or it's attributed to him as saying, is that one of the problems in the Dutch defense is that in the middle game, uh, Black's best move is often the move f5 to f7. So you can figure that one out. Obviously, you can't make reverse pawn moves, but the point he's making is that black has weakened his king side, and oftentimes he wish he wish he could take that move. He wishes he can take that move back. So, uh, moving on in our analysis, now we look at the pawn structure. Pawn structure is good for both sides. Again, save the weakness that black has created there. Um, Weak and strong squares. Well, looking at it from the black perspective, black has a very strong square possessing e4. G4 is also good for black, and also the C3 square. Again, what do I mean? I'm looking at squares in my enemy's territory, right, that he can't readily possess without being captured. For instance, C3 square. If it were white's move, he couldn't play this move because he would be captured by the knight. So this is a square in enemy territory that black possesses. So that means this is good for black. E4 again, this in enemy territory. G4, this is also in white's territory. Okay, anything past this imaginary line right here between ranks 5 and 4, right, going toward the bottom of the screen, that would be considered white's territory. So black possesses control over these squares. So that's good for black. On the other side, white, you see all of these pawns on the queen side here. White possesses in black's territory b5 square, c5, and e5 square. Why do I say that? Because again, black is not able to, safely put a piece here or even a pawn here without being captured. Same with this square g5 in this territory. You can't put a piece there without being captured, or pawn there. All right. Now these squares are contested in the territory. So for instance, black can't put a piece here, but if he wanted, he could fight for the square. All right, that's still good for white, but it's up for grabs. All right, those are contested squares. So we can see that both sides, right, have a fair share of weak and strong squares, albeit on pretty much on the opposite sides of the board. Continuing on in our analysis, we look at the center, and when I consider the center, I'm just thinking of these four squares in the center, not the extended center where we look at C4, C5, F5, and F4, and so on. Again, this is pretty even. We have black occupying and possessing this E4 square, controlling the E4 square. Um, and he doesn't have any control over his square D5, right? The white controls that square. White also controls D4, right? He also controls E5. So white has a little bit more control in the center than white does here. Space, that's pretty obvious. White has more space on the queen side. Black, due to his advanced F pawn, has more space on the king side. And this often dictates the major strategy of the game going forward, where typically in the Dutch, black will pursue his chances on the king side, white on the queen side. Finally, we look at a development, the piece location. Development is pretty much the same. Again, we're like 7 moves in. There's no significant lead in development. And piece location is pretty much a wash also, as both sides have adopted the fianchetto setup, although black has his knight on e4, so it's advanced in a position. And we could say, give a slight nod to black if we want to, get real picky about it. That his knight is advanced further up the board and is in a beautiful central location, excellent for attacking prospects in the future. All right. So now with all of that said, what's our final verdict on the position? Well, I'd say the position is pretty equal. Um, each side has small advantages in their position and also some weaknesses in the position. Okay, but we can't say that white is way better or better than black or vice versa. The game is still up for grabs. Of course, there's some static weakness here in black's position. Again, that A2 to a G8 diagonal, all right, can lead to some issues in king safety later on. But right now, we can't say that there's some type of big issue that warrants, uh, for instance, a sacrifice of a pawn or something like that uh, for white to press on an attack. Okay, so with the analysis done and the position being equal, what's the main ideas in the position? Well, we kind of hinted on it earlier with the space advantage on the king side for black and his horse that is sitting on e4, right, with great influence in the position of white. Black's main idea here is to utilize his extra space on in that sector of the board to execute the king side attack. All right, so that's his main uh, purpose from this position here. Now, of course, you can't just ignore the plans of the opponent. And being that white has a tremendous advantage on in space on the queen side, black ideally would love to either destroy those pawns, right? We would all love to capture our opponent's pawns, destroy those pawns on the queen side, or demobilize them. Because when you demobilize them, then they become liabilities to the opponent and just become targets. All right. So if you can't win those pawns, or destroy them, then fix them in a way where they're no longer useful to the opponent. Okay. Now coming to the white side, again, white has an advantage on the queen side in space. So of course he would love to continue to push his pawns, right, to cramp the black position over there, and of course keep his pawns mobile. Conversely, all right, he would also like to utilize open diagonals if he could to exploit the potential weakness of the A2 G8 diagonal toward the king. All right, so and furthermore, most importantly, he would love to take over the E4 square from black. All right. Again, you don't want to forget about your opponent's strong points. You want to uh, take away his advantages if you can while pursuing your own plan. So of course, where white is strong is on the queen side, and he wants to continue to expand over there. At the same time, he wants to cripple his opponent. So this knight on e4 is something that white does not want, as it controls squares, as we mentioned earlier with the c3 square, for instance, in the territory, tax f2, right? Uh, it's just an albatross in the position, and this is definitely, sorry about that, didn't mean to sack the knight. This is definitely something that white would look forward to getting rid of. So now with all of those ideas in mind, let's continue on with the game. Malaniuk played the move e6, all right? And I don't think I need to mention this, but of course, in the analysis we talked about the development of the pieces. There's many pieces that still aren't developed, so of course, the development of the pieces has to be completed. So let's just throw that in there. So e6 is played. d6 is also possible, of course, and possibly a little more normal. Okay, but they both do the same thing with the assisting of the development of the pieces. It depends on where you decide to put your pieces at. But notice the plans are the same. Notice how white addresses the knight on e4. Knight is exchanged. Black is addressing the queen side expansion of white with moves like c6. Again, this is separate analysis right here. D5 expanding, taking over the diagonal. Okay, so you can match all of these moves up with the previous analysis. Once you have the correct analysis, then you make a plan, and then all the moves just fall in line. Again, just trying to just break down the pawns, right? We spoke about this. Knight f6, and c takes d5. And here we can see that white has a slight space advantage. Okay, still. So black hasn't completely destroyed the pawns on the queen side, but he's broken it down a little. Okay, this was between a game between uh, Sadler, British Grandmaster, and Malaniuk. All right, this game ended in the draw. All right, so again, this will be annoying for black, and eventually he probably would have to play a move like e6 to break down this pawn right here. But then he would be left with an isolated pawn and so on. But Malaniuk was able to draw. So here he played e6 instead. Perhaps he didn't like that position, although he was able to hold, and he opts for a different idea. Now with e6, that lets me know that, okay, you must plan on bringing your bishop out this way. Because by putting another pawn on the light squares over here, this bishop is not going anywhere. So b6, bishop b7 come to mind, and perhaps d6 later. Again, you still have to deal with the expansion of white on the queen side. All right, because black is not really ready to expand on the king side yet. So he has to still develop his pieces and make some prophylactic moves in order not to get ran over on the queen side. So bishop b2, b6, and you see the development of the pieces here. Knight c3, challenging e4, bishop b7. Remember we were saying how black would like to continue to control e4 if he can. Right, it's all in the analysis of the position. Right, where you're strong, you want to stay strong. Okay, and where you're weak, you want to try to mitigate that weakness. And this is what you see here. Rook c1, a5. Again, sorry to sound repetitive, but I just want to make sure that the point gets across. Again, either you're going to destroy your opponent's pawn or demobilize them, right? Render them ineffective. So here he plays a5. Now we're attacking the moving target here. So obviously, Malaniuk was aware that b5 could be played as in his position. So obviously his plan is more or less to demobilize the pawns. Okay, so the pawns will be there, but be ineffective. d6, and now knight e1 is played. So still a situation where white is playing against e4 here. There's a very strong point for black. So he's playing against e4 here. So knight e1. So knight takes c3. And the bishop is hanging here, but the queen is being attacked. So bishop takes c3. Bishop takes g2. Knight takes g2. So there's been a trade-off here. So white has traded off of black's pieces that were influencing e4, namely knight f6 and the bishop on b7. Okay, so that puts him in a better position to where he can perhaps take over e4. However, he's lost his powerful bishop on g2, and thus, has lessened the protection that he has on the king side from, say, an oncoming king side assault from black. All right, so it's double edged. Now knight d7. Okay, so looking at the queen side idea, I keep referencing back to these plans and ideas. So now the question is really, okay, how is white going to continue his queen side attack? It's very difficult with the knight here on d7. You had the pawn on b6 and d6, slowing up any kind of advance on c5, right? And then a4 would be useless, right, in the position. And so this is kind of what black wants: to bog white down on the queen side, and then perhaps start expanding uh, on the opposite side of the board. Right? If he had his way, maybe he'd get his queen here. Play moves like g5, get over here on the queen side, get this rook over here. Right? Start moving these pawns. Notice also the strategic placement of this knight, whereby f5, f4 is hard to obtain because the knight can just capture. And there it is, knight f4. So with this attack here, so of course being difficult, can't just play that. Queen e7, and now d5. Now what does d5 do? d5 is attacking the e6 square, but it weakens the c5 square. All right. So again, black has completed his plan of crippling or demobilizing the white queenside assault. So it's a good plan, to put in your memory banks as far as dealing with this idea of this queenside expansion. However, at the same time, black has to now deal with this powerful knight that will be able to come to e6. For instance, after a move like e5, black still will maintain his control over e4, right? Have more space in the center, keep his bishop on the board, but he would give up this square. So knight c5 is played, and what that does is, of course, besides occupying this square, it deals with the immediate threat of knight taking e6. So white plays knight takes e6. Excuse me, d takes e6. Knight takes e6. Bishops come off the board. And now we have this beautiful diagonal open. King takes g7. And now knight d5. So we see a trade-off here. So white couldn't occupy the e6 square, so he takes the d5 square. Okay, it's very, very powerful square. And of course, he would like to take over this diagonal. All right. So here, the knight is white's knight is more powerful than his counterpart here. Queen f7. All right. Now rook c3. And the idea is again to occupy the open files here. So here we have a semi-open file situation. Now king g8, getting off of the diagonal. Rook e3, rook a e8. Queen a1, taking over the diagonal. And now let's do another analysis at this point, just really quick. Okay, so what has changed here in this position from our earlier analysis? Now we're 22 moves in, and again we do we want to do a similar analysis just to clarify things and see how the plans have progressed here. So again, we go through the same 7 steps. We look at the king safety. It's a wash. The kings are both safe. Nobody's getting mated. But again, the king is a little exposed here, as you can see on this diagonal. He can't go here, h8, right? He can't occupy these squares. So king is a little drafty, okay, with this diagonal being open like that. All right, but there's no immediate threat of mate, but nevertheless, it's something you want to acknowledge. There's no step 2. There's no direct threats in the position right now. And of course, it's black's move right now. There's no threats in the position. Materials are still equal. And again, we look at step 4, open files or in diagonals. And this is real obvious as you see the queen just sitting there on a1. The h8 diagonal is wide open, and then other than that, the position is relatively closed, save the semi-open e file that the white rook is sitting on. So again, we want to acknowledge those files and that they are possessed by white at this time. Pawn structure, uh, good for both sides. Um, and now here's where the biggest change is taking place, and why I wanted to do the analysis again here so you can see what has changed is in the weak and strong squares. If we look at the weak and strong squares for white, we see that white has made a lot of progress. All right, and so let's look at the strong squares for white. A6, and again, if they're strong for white, that means conversely they're weak for black. So A6, C6, strong for white. E7, why? Can't possess that square without getting captured and losing material. So E7 is great for white. F6, again, it's very strong for white. Then of course, in the territory, B5, D5, of course H8, white also owns that square. Can't even use his own property here. Okay, so very strong possession of all of those squares by white. All right. Now, what you want to note in that is the reason why white has so much control uh, over those squares is mainly due to the knight and the queen. All right. So the light bulb should go off in your head. What would black like to do to most in that position? Trade off the knight and the queen. All right. We're not finished with our analysis yet, but that's why you do the analysis. It will lead you on the path to finding the right move. Now we look at the other side, of course. Black's weak squares and weak and strong squares. Now we don't have to look at black's weak squares because we looked at white's strong squares. All you do is have to just flip it, and the squares that are strong for white or weak for black. So you don't have to uh, look at that. So let's look at the squares that are strong for black, which conversely would be weak for white. Black pretty much has control over the same squares that he had earlier. E4, right? This pawn still sitting here strong. So E4 is good for white still, for black, and G4. D4 is good for black. Why? Because again, can't possess that square safely in his own territory without being captured by the knight. All right, so black has not really made progress in as far as expanding his power on the king side, but he has maintained what he had basically in the opening there. All right. So he has not gotten to a place where he can actually conduct the king side attack, but he still has the potential in the position. Now we go to space and center. Again, that's pretty much stayed the same, except white has gained more space now in the center. He has space advantage on the queen side. Black has a space advantage on the king side, but now due to this knight being on d5, again, your bell should be ringing. That knight on d5 is very powerful, and now white has a space advantage in the center. Okay. Looking at the central squares in more detail, the four central squares, and black actually has more control over these central squares. Remember, we mentioned the square d4 can't be really occupied by white because the knight is controlling that. This pawn on f5 is controlling the e4 square, and this pawn on d6 is controlling the e5 square. So black has good control over these three squares in the center, and as you can see, white controls d5. Right, so this is actually good for black, that he has the control over these three squares. And development is basically a wash. All the pieces are developed. And finally, piece location. We have to give the nod to white because his pieces are better placed in black. This rook on e3 is excellent on this semi-open file. The knight d5 is probably the best piece on the board. Either that or this queen on a1, which is excellently placed on the diagonal. All right. So again, it's black to move here. So I already hinted at black strategy here. Oh, of course, I want to give white a slight advantage in this position due to his space advantage in the center and his hold over so many squares in the black territory. All right. So with that said, what is the cause of white's control over so many squares? It's mainly this queen on a1, this knight on d5. So black strategy has to be to eliminate those pieces, and he should be okay. All right. So the plan here should be to eliminate this knight on d5 and trade off the queens. So that way the diagonal can be occupied by the black pieces. All right. So let's see what happened with those ideas in mind. Black played knight g7. All right, facilitating, of course, the trade of rooks. And now queen c3 was played. Knight h5. And if you understand black's idea, then you can understand the moves. He realizes, hey, I have to get rid of this knight. So that's what this maneuver is about, is bringing this knight to f6 in order to trade off the knight on d5. Rook takes, rook takes. So now the rook is eliminated off e3. And you can see how black is just solving his problems. Rook e1. And now the rook comes to e6. And this allows some more fortification in the position so that, black is preparing to play this move. So rook e6, e3, knight f6. Knight takes f6. And queen takes f6 is played here. He wants to get rid of the queens too. Queen takes f6. Rook takes f6. Okay. Now this is a pretty much a drawn ending here, but black still has to play carefully. All right. So you saw the analysis, and you saw black go through with basically the correct plan to deal with it. Okay. You still have this issue here with the battle over e4, right? So here you see that it's possible for white to take over the e4 square by playing the move e4 himself finally. But what I do want you to see is note how the plans on both sides worked out. Like black had the space has the space advantage on the king side. He wasn't really able to ever expand because he still controls e4. White had this expansion on the queen side, but his pawns became fixed. He wasn't really able to, to do anything or break through on the queen side. And now we're in this end game. Okay, so now again, it will be time for planning out in the end game now. All right. A lot of the features are still the same, but now, for instance, white doesn't have all the control that he had before in the position. All right. So f4. Now, what's the plan? It's mapped out right here, right? is basically to get the king as far up into the position as possible. All right, and then push the pawn from e3 to e4. Okay, utilizing again the same features that we mentioned earlier, which is the space advantage on the queen side. All right, he just doesn't have a bunch of other pieces to assist. King f7 here. He wants to bring his king to the center here. I like rook e6. Again, keeping an eye on this right here. So for instance, king f2, rook e4. You're shutting that down. The rook has to protect. And now king f7, king e2, for example, and h6 is good. And I don't see what progress white is going to make here. The pawns seem to be all fixed to me. Black is not going to win here either, but these guys probably could shake hands. And then finally, we see an old plan that we mentioned earlier, which is back to destroying the white pawns on the queen side. And we see d5 being played there successfully, and that's exactly what would happen. After c takes, just to go on here, after c takes d5, either rook a4, challenging the a2 pawn, or rook b4 would be played. However, instead of this move, which I believe is the correct move, king f7 was played. King f2, and now king e6. And if you notice in this position, this rook is a little misplaced here. Now, because what is the rook doing? Again, the last opportunity to play this move. And remember, this was like the big thing in the opening, is this control over e4. So after many moves, black kind of loses sight, and now white finally gets to challenge e4. All right, so now king d7, king e3, rook f7, and it seems like he's waiting on white to play e takes f5. King d4, and now f takes e4 finally from black. Rook takes e4. So now black has lost ground in the position, in that he has now lost his space advantage on the king side and control over the e4 square. White has control over the only open file. All right, so he has more space on the queen side and center, and he controls the only open file, and he has a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side now. Okay, so white's plan is simple. Okay, it's to create a pass pawn. The pass pawn on the king side, and move his king up as far as possible to place pressure on those queen side pawns of black. So h5, a4, rook f8, h3, rook f7, g4, h takes, and now rook h7. Black doesn't want to trade rooks because the endgame is bad for him, so his only choice now is to create a counterplay. He's not lost here, but it's a dangerous position. White pushes to create the pass pawn, and now rook f7. Now the rook is become passive for black here. Again, he's still, not totally busted, but it's getting close. King d5, and now king f6. So now the king replaces the rook with the duty of holding back the pawn. All right. And now we want to think about the principle of two weaknesses. All right. If black only has one weakness here, he can defend. But if white can somehow create another weakness, all right, a situation where black is forced to defend on two fronts, distracted, then he can win the game. And this is kind of the theme that would take place here. So king f6, rook f1, rook e7. So black's plan is just basically to shuttle back and forth on the seventh rank, right? Because he has to protect this pawn here, and then he has to stop this pawn at the same time, right? This is what keeps him tied up. Of course, at this moment, he wants to avoid dropping this pawn here, but even still, with this king coming here, it's very difficult for black. So king c6, rook h7. So now black is tied up here. The rook is tied here, and the king is tied here. So now, how to make progress? If the white rook just leaves, then the pawn will be captured, and so black just wants to keep going back and forth on the seventh rank. Okay. However, white comes up with a nice plan, and it's simply basically to trade the f pawn for the c pawn, because the superior position of his king will win the day, as those pawns are very vulnerable if the c pawn drops. So rook f3 is played, rook e7, rook f2, rook h7, rook f1, rook g7, and a lot of jostling around. Finally, king b7 is played, rook g7. Again, some maneuvering, and it looks like, what are these guys doing? It might have been time scramble situation, whatever. But the plan is pretty simple. Again, to trade this f pawn for the c pawn. How is he going to do that? Well, you would take the rook and put it here, right? The king is of course cut off. The pawn has to be captured. This rook comes to e8, then to c7, and captures right here. And then you can see the b and a pawns are just up for grabs. That's the idea. So we'll just go past, and then finally rook e1 is played, rook e8, rook g4, king c7, rook takes, king takes, rook takes, king c6, rook b4, and then b6, and Malaniuk had to resign. I'm sorry, rook b6, b6, and Malaniuk had to resign. Right? Rook c4 check, king d6, a4, b6, rook b4, king c6, a3, b7, and again, rook takes b7, king takes b7, or a2, rook a8, and white is going to win. So the game was a little bit long, but very instructive. I hope you enjoyed that game. Again, black should have drawn that game, but things happen. Again, rook e6 is the move there. Again, there's a lot of lessons to learn in that game, and I hope you enjoyed that. I hope the analysis portions helped you going through the 7 steps, analysis on two different occasions. Yeah, interesting, very interesting game. Going over it again. So again, please like and subscribe, support my channel. Please donate, and also check the links below. There's DVDs and or books always related to the opening that we went over. In this case, it's the Dutch defense. So you'll see some DVDs, chess base, or what have you, on that opening. Any questions, just comment below, and I love to hear your feedback, and I'll see you guys on the next video.